Now, the main topic of today's meeting is about the evolution of disk storage, which will be presented by Derick van Eeden. And the featured item in the I Didn't Know I Can Do That series is about virtual private networks. I will tell you more about that after the main topic of the day. Now, to get back to the main topic, every computer, as you know, needs disk storage. If you own a computer, you have some form of disk storage. And over the last 50 years, many types of storage devices were developed. It's all about storage capacity, the physical size of the device, the read and write speeds, the compatibility between different operating systems, the durability of the device, and of course the price. Now, in my mind, this topic suited one of our members like a glove, or rather, one of our members suited this topic like a dream. With his extensive knowledge and years of experience as an IT manager, Derick van Eeden is the ideal person to tell us all about computer storage. Derick has done a few NIR presentations before, and I'm sure you can expect another well-prepared and thorough presentation. You are welcome to post questions in the chat panel during his presentation. I will browse through the questions and comments and put it to Derick after the presentation. There will be ample time to discuss questions. So, Derick, it's over to you.
Thanks, Johan. I've just shared the presentation, so you can maybe just confirm if you guys can see that, because I'm on a different screen here.
Yes.
Thank you. I can see the thumbs up there. So once again, good morning to Johan and all fellow nerds. Johan asked me to talk about disk storage, but you will note that I have titled this talk Data Storage Devices, as disks were only one of the storage mediums on which data has been stored over time. So let me attempt to show you a short video of about 2 minutes. It has a slight American flavor, but it will give you a basic understanding of the magnitudes of data growth, which is accelerating exponentially. Good. So you can see from that video that data storage and data growth is exploding. That last slide showed you that in terms of the growth in IT spend versus the growth in actual data, the growth is exceeding the IT spend by far. So people need to be more clever and find new ways of storing data and accessing and processing that. So when one gathers items, one often the need often arises to be able to store it somewhere where it will be kept together and protected for later consumption, movement, or sharing. Whether it's a farmer that needs to store grain or an author that writes a book, which she populates with information to later be accessed again or to be shared with others, or if you simply want to put some items together to keep them safe and to make it easier. Johan, let me just quickly change the layout of my presentation here. Sorry, the Zoom window is just obscuring some of my information here. I'm just trying to find a quick way of getting rid of it.
I still see your main title slide.
Yes, you should be seeing that. I'm just finding that Zoom is obscuring some of the stuff that I actually need to see here. Good. I think we can get going. Yes. So if you simply need to put some items together to keep them safe or make it easier to move as a collective, using some sorts of storage container will provide and considerably enhance this ability. So when we work with data, similarly, it also needs to be stored somewhere for later consumption or processing. Data is just some raw facts and figures, coded and structured for subsequent processing. When data is interpreted, organized, and structured, or presented so as to make it meaningful or useful, then we call it information. Information, therefore, provides context to the data. So once all this processing has completed and we have turned the data into information, it is important to store that and to keep that for future use. One does not want to repeat that every time that one wants to access the information. So whatever you put in that storage container, it allows you to keep things together, it allows you to keep it safe, and it allows you to keep it accessible. And in the context of what we are discussing today, the container that we will be looking at is data storage. And it could be a disk, it could be many form factors, and we'll quickly have a look at those. As early computers had very little memory, it was necessary to have some mechanism to store larger amounts of data outside of the machine's memory. A program could then access, retrieve, and process small portions of the data and swap these out on an as-needed basis. As thick communication lines were not available way back when, yet another concern was being able to transport programs and data between computers located at different sites. For example, a programmer who created an interesting routine in Somerset West may well have wanted to share the fruits of his or her labors with colleagues in Durbanville. And often the data had to be physically ported by hand on some form or media. Everybody stores data. We often take the devices that store our data for granted as they have become inexpensive and efficient. There are also mostly these data devices are not even visible to us, as nowadays they are embedded within the devices which we use, which may be fairly small, such as a cell phone. A cell phone now is much smaller than what a typical hard drive was in a PC 10 years ago. They have really become invisible, the fact that the data is being stored on some device. We just see it as part of the device. As you can imagine, it would be somewhat inconvenient to have a computer that forgot everything that it knew every time its operator turned the machine off before stepping out for a bite of lunch or even at home with a family. Similarly, a programmer's frustration could be imagined if, after spending countless hours writing a program or entering data, a janitor carelessly disconnects the computer in order to vacuum the office and everything is lost. The story actually starts with paper. So punch cards dates back to the 19th century, when it was used to program mechanical devices such as fabric-producing looms. Many of you might also be familiar with the old player pianos, which used a similar mechanism and were able to play a nice tune without the pianist on the chair. Punch cards were the first mechanical storage method of data. A mechanically activated printer would punch small holes in a piece of paper, and data was represented by the presence or absence of a hole at a particular location. A coded message consisting of a sequence of holes or absence of holes and representing bits or bytes in the end were then encoded onto these cards, which were read by machines and then acted accordingly. If you wanted to match the capacity of a modern day 1 terabyte drive, you would need about 14 billion of these punch cards. This is an example of a punch card and what it looks like. These cards were bulky to handle, they were expensive to produce, to process, and to store. Being only paper, they were also, what's the word I'm looking for, eligible to be eaten by rats and mice, and you know, if the storage wasn't secure, they could be reused, they could not be reused, and they could file only as much information as can be stored in an available 80 characters. So you'll see when you look at that card, the width of that is 80 characters. And if you look at the card from top to bottom, each column that you see there represents one character in that line of 80 characters. So the example that we are looking at here, at the top, you will see the numbers 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. And if you look below each of those numbers, you will see what the encoding looked like for a 0, a 1, a 2, a 3, and similarly for the alphabet, which goes from A to Z. The rows across you'll see is only running from 0 to 9, and there are many more letters in the alphabet than 9 or 10, including the 0. So what they did was at the top in that open space, you'll see there was an extra punch for an A, and then they would punch the 1, the row which contains the 1s. But if you go further to the right, you would see if they punched the J, they would also punch a hole in the row that contains the 1s, but the control character above it would just be slightly different. There were several file integrity problems that were risks with these cards. Not only could these cards be removed from stacks, but they could be replaced with other cards, with altered data, and they could easily be lost or stolen. Punch cards were commonly used for computer programming up to the 1980s. I remember when I started my studies at Stellenbosch University, punch cards were still forced onto the first-year students, and any programming that you had to do were done on these punch cards. They had machines that looked similar to a desk where you could sit down and feed in blank cards. It had a keyboard that you could type on, and it would then punch one line of code onto one of these cards. If you made a mistake, you had to throw the card away, eject it, and restart typing that line. Eventually, a program might consist out of many of these lines. You had to make sure that once these cards were punched, that the sequence of those were not mixed or that they weren't shuffled. Otherwise, you can imagine the logic in the program getting shuffled. And often these were held together by simply by a piece of elastic band, which over time would become brittle. And in more than one instance, I carried a pack of these cards where the elastic band suddenly snapped and the cards sprawled onto the floor. And you can imagine how long it took to get those back. The printing at the top of those cards and all of the numbers that you see on the cards, that wasn't used by the computer. Those were simply for human consumption and to make things visible and understandable to a unit. So if the elastic snapped and your card sprawled across the floor, typically if you were coding a program, there would be a line number printed on those cards as well, and you could use that and visually look at that to try and reorder your cards and assemble those together. That pack of cards would then be taken and put into a hopper, into another electronic device called a card reader, and at a very high speed, faster than what the eye can follow, it would actually run through that set of cards, scan all of these holes on the cards, interpret that as instructions, feed it into the computer. The computer would execute those instructions, and the output of that would then be written somewhere. Typically, it could be punched on more cards or printed out on a printer in later years. The earliest forms of punched tape came from weaving looms and embroidery, where the cards with simple instructions about the machine's intended movements were first fed individually as instructions, then controlled by instruction cards, and later these were fed as a string of connected cards, which eventually became paper tape. The concept of communicating data not as a stream of individual cards, but as one continuous long card, then utilized the tape, similar to that little diagram that you're seeing there. So on the tape, each character was represented by one row. In this case, it was 7-bit ASCII. So you'll see vertically there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 columns of the bigger holes, and there's one column after column 4 of smaller holes. The smaller holes there were typically used by a ratcheted wheel that would just pull the tape through the machine at a predetermined and a constant speed. The example you're seeing there is an example of the word Wikipedia being punched onto paper tape. The first line across is the W, the second line is the I, and similarly working all the way down. The last two there, you'll see a carriage return and a line feed, and that instructed the computer that that was the end of this line. Because if you remember the card that we just looked at had a line of 80 characters. On the paper tape, each row across is actually just one character. So somehow reading down this tape, the computer had to know when we reached the end of the line. And that was signified by a carriage return and line feed, which was a special character, and are the two that you see at the bottom there. So a W was typically represented by holes, and those would correspond to bits, which was 10, 10, 111, and you could see that in the format of the holes there. Because of all the potential problems with paper-based media, engineers searched for better ways to store and work with data. The first magnetic drum held about 48 KB or 48,000 bytes or characters, and that was the equivalent to about 4 formatted MS Word pages, a document with 4 pages. The drum memory was originally invented by Gustav Tauchek in 1932, but magnetic drum memory wasn't used in computing until the Navy codebreakers developed and started using it at the time of World War II. Drum memory consisted of a long metal cylinder, which was coated in a ferromagnetic material with rows of read and write heads, which were situated on the axis of the drum. A drum was about 16 inches long. It typically held about 40 tracks across, and it spun at about 12,500 revolutions per minute. Magnetic drums could be considered the precursor to the hard drive, which we use today. Invented in Germany in 1928 and patented a few years prior to drum memory, but magnetic tape was first used to store data only in 1951 on the Eckhard Morchi Univac 1 computer, which was a fairly big computer, and it probably filled a complete room. The way this works is that tape drives use motors to wind the magnetic tape from reel to reel while passing the tape past an electronic head, which then reads, writes, or erases the data. Drawback of magnetic tape was that data could only be accessed sequentially. So while several files could be stored on a single reel, you had to actually scan past all of the data from the start of the reel until you found the file that you were looking for. To try and get around that and provide some speed while searching, these tapes could then scan at higher speeds than when it would normally read. And the tape drives would simply scan for file markers, which determined and delimited the start and the end of each file. Header information could then quickly be checked before continuing the scan along the tape until the required file was found, These tapes were very big and they were cumbersome, and they required complete rooms or vaults for storage, and were typically moved around that room on trolleys where they were hung like washing on a line. These tapes had a canister around the outside of it, which was removed before it was actually mounted onto the machine. But these canisters had a little hook that you could hook onto these trolleys, and the computer operator could then wheel these around the computer room. Before a day started, operators would typically select and plan for a pool of scratch tapes. These were tapes that could be used for writing new data. And if any of these programs wanted to access existing data, which were written to tapes previously, it would issue a message to the computer operator, who would then have to physically run around a room to identify, find, and fetch the required tape reel, run back to a tape drive mounted on the drive. In the first days, they had to feed it through this actual drive so that it could go past the heads, and it had little rollers that pulled the tape through the drive. Later on, those were fed automatically, and they were actually blown through the system by compressed air, which was quite impressive to see. It was a mechanical process. But eventually this tape was mounted, and the program that was waiting for this tape would then start reading the tape and processing the data, and eventually would output some form of output onto another tape for subsequent use later on, or on another day, another week, or another month, if it was a month-end run. These tapes obviously had lots of problems, although the tape drives tried to accommodate breakages or prevent breakages by having some slack in the tape as it was mounted in the drive. You can think, if you just think about the physical side of it, the one reel is typically always fuller than the other reel, which means that for the tape to move past the drive head or the read-write head at a constant speed, these two reels had to move at different speeds. You know, the reel supplying the tape and the reel taking up the already read tape had to accommodate how full these reels were. At times, there were problems in these drives, and the tapes would simply break, which meant the program would simply stop and grind to a halt. So these were often interruptions that would occur in the use of these tapes. The first hard drive, as we are used to having in our typical computers nowadays, was introduced by IBM in 1956, and it was introduced as secondary storage. It weighed over a ton and was the size of, probably the size of about 2 large refrigerators. Computers have memory in them, which is used and where the data is accessed from for actual processing and manipulation. But the data needs to come from somewhere, as the memory is non-volatile. The memory is actually volatile, sorry. So when you switch off a computer, the contents of the memory is what? It disappears. When you switch that computer back on again, the operating system needs to be loaded, the data that needs to be processed needs to be loaded, and the actual program or code that manipulates the data also needs to be loaded. That is brought in from secondary storage, where the prime memory, where all of this processing happens, is the primary storage. So the first hard drive that IBM introduced in 1956 had a storage capacity of only around 3.75 megs, which in today's terms would store the equivalent of probably 1 digital photo, or around 45 seconds of low-resolution video. The hard drive stores data on 1 or more rapidly rotating metal platters or disks that are coated with a magnetic material, and each of these disks has 1 movable read or write head that can actually access the data on that platter. These platters then are structured into tracks and sectors into which the data is structured and stored. Data rates are influenced by store and seek and transfer times, and to just explain that, the platter is circular, so obviously it revolves. To find a specific piece of data, that head had to move, instructed by the code, onto the correct track. Once it reached the correct track, it had to wait for that platter to rotate and for the data to pass underneath the head until the specific bit of data that it needed aligned with that head. And once that happened, it could only start reading the data. And then there was transfer time to actually transfer the identified data, which it had to seek for, into memory so that that could then be used for processing. Just like computers, hard disk drives also contain their own memory, or it is named cache in this case, which provides for efficiency. Some algorithms try and forecast which data is used often and then tries and keeps this in memory, or it also tries to do reader heads because of the seek and the transfer times, which in computer terms are actually really long. If it can find it in the cache, it can actually provide it to the computer system or the program much quicker. So just an interesting snippet. It is actually quite difficult to erase data off these hard drives. They are recorded magnetically. The good news is that if you've accidentally wiped your holiday photos, you could probably recover it if you have the right program and the right skills. But it's also pretty bad if you're wanting to dispose of sensitive company information, and you want to dispose of old or used hard drives. But you want to protect that sensitive company information. Whenever data is deleted from a hard drive, we are just simply clearing index pointers on that drive. We are not actually removing or deleting the data. The actual data remains on the internal hard drive and on that magnetic media. And if you think that your data is safely deleted from your hard drive once you've pushed the delete button, you are wrong. The deleted data will be safe only once the data is overwritten by junk files or overwritten with zeros. One could use wiping software, which will cover up the data with more data and obviously does a multipass in order to achieve this. But even so, forensic experts are often still able to recover some of the data off these old used drives, even if it had been deleted or it had been overwritten. One way of truly knowing that the data has been wiped is by eliminating it via a magnetic field. And this is a technique called degaussing. So companies would have specific machines, which were quite expensive, that once a computer was decommissioned, these hard drives would be disassembled and taken out of those computers, and they would be put into the degaussing machine, which magnetically would erase all of the information on there before these old hard drives would then be disposed of and be recycled for reuse, not of the actual drive, but of all the components which it was manufactured and made of. After that, in 1967, we saw the advent of the floppy disk. The floppy disk was developed also by IBM at their San Jose laboratories in 1967. The first 8-inch floppy disk developed held about 80 KB, which was enough to hold about 8 formatted doc files. Originally, floppy disks were uncovered magnetic disks, which were floppy, as the name suggests. And later on, plastic envelopes were added to protect them from dirt and scratches. And varying sizes of these disks emerged. By the mid-70s, floppy disks were the most widely used form of portable data storage. By 1978, more than 10 manufacturers were producing the 5¼ inch floppy drive format. You might probably remember the 3.5-inch disk the best, which was the last version of this that we saw. Microsoft Windows or Office installation media would often require a pile as high as a coffee mug just to carry the installation files on these floppy disks. And another interesting snippet is that these floppy disks, and the one seen in the example there, when I was involved in IT and we used these, we refer to these as stiffies, and it was because of the more rigid housing than what the original floppies had. But on a trip to the US in 1994, I had a discussion with some other technical people around disk technology and these disks. And speaking about stiffies, I could quickly gather that they were not following what I was speaking about. And I then found out that the term stiffy was a South African term, which was basically mostly just used in South Africa. And the rest of the world were also referring to the rigid version as a floppy disk. There are several sources on the internet that claim that floppy disks are shockingly still utilized in some nuclear bases, but I cannot confirm or deny that information. Then the compact disc was developed in 1982 by Sony and Philips. It was the first highly portable optical storage, although the CD was about 12 centimeters in diameter when first introduced, and at the time it could hold more data than a computer's hard drive. CD drives read the data stored on the disk by shining a focused laser beam at the surface of the disk. And a couple of facts about a CD: they are made principally of injection molded polycarbonate. The diameter of these is around 120 millimeters. They are about 1.2 millimeters thick. They contain up to 680 megabytes of data, which is the equivalent of around 250,000 double-sided leaves of A4 text, which coincidentally would be about 83 feet high and would need about 8 trees to make, if you stack those on top of each other. The music on a CD is imprinted in the form, or data is imprinted in the form of bits of varying length and on a spiral track, which runs around this disk and is in length is around 5.66 kilometers long, and it fits onto that small little disk. There are approximately 16 billion bits of 0.11 micrometers on these disks. The largest bit dimension is 3 microns, and the smallest is about 0.8 microns. The width of the bits is about half a micron, which is the distance that a human hair grows in 2 minutes or a fingernail grows in 7 minutes. This is about 700 times smaller than a pinprick. A CD could hold 140 minutes of low-resolution video, or more appropriately, it could hold your favorite Jim Reeves album. CDs therefore revolutionized the music industry in the 1980s and eventually replaced both the vinyl record and the cassette tape. But I have noticed that vinyl is making a comeback, especially around audiophiles, and there are some shops that specialize in selling those again. Also developed by Sony and Philips, in addition to a host of other technology companies, the DVD came into existence in 1995. The DVD stores data using the same optical functions as the CD, but with improved storage capability. The first DVD had about 1.46 gigs of storage, which is big enough to hold a short movie, a low-res movie, or 2 CDs. Later on, the most common size was 4.7 gig. But they later started manufacturing multi-layer and double-sided discs, which had a capacity of up to 17 gigs. The initials DVD were originally an acronym for digital video disc, and while it was suggested that the name should change to digital versatile disc, the initials eventually became the official name of the disc, as its creators could not agree upon the extended name. At this time, the DVD changed the movie industry, phasing out widely used VHS system, which was also a magnetic tape format used for media. And after enjoying its day in the sun, the DVD was later eclipsed by Blu-ray discs. The first SD card held around 64 megs of data, which was enough to hold around 50 photos or 13 minutes of low-resolution video, was around 1/11 the capacity of a CD. The highest capacity of an SD card today is several terabytes in that small little form factor. The secure digital standard was a joint development by SanDisk, Panasonic, and Toshiba in 1999. This technology built on previous iterations such as the multimedia card, which some of you might know, and was used in devices such as cameras, but was slightly bigger than the SD card. SD cards use flash memory, which stores data in cells made of floating gate transistors. And these are very, very small and therefore allow this very small form factor. The small size and the thinness of the cards make them ideal for digital photography and videography. Capacity is not the only consideration though. Transfer speed is also important, especially nowadays with high-res media, where one starts seeing things such as 4K and even 8K floating around. Later on, mini and micro sizes of the SD cards were released, and together with these, one typically would also receive adapters, which would allow one to read these smaller cards, that add the smaller form factor in older or larger card slots in computers. So you could take the smaller card, the micro SD card, put it in a container which was the size of an SD card, and then put that into a computer slot which was of an SD size, and actually read the micro SD card. And that was just for compatibility, backward compatibility purposes. You will notice that these SD cards also have a form factor which prevents them from being inserted incorrectly. So there's notches and some corners that are tapered, that when you put them in upside down, they actually will not enter the slot. So you would be knowledgeable about that, and then you could turn that around and make sure that you insert them correctly. USB flash drive, the storage type of many names. The first flash drive developed held about 8 megs. So it would be 1 or 2 ebooks or 90 seconds of low-res video, or about 800 doc files. The world's largest USB flash drive today has about a 2 terabyte capacity. M Systems was an Israeli company that developed the USB flash drive in 1999. It was colloquially known as a thumb drive, or a pen drive, or a jump drive, or a disk key, or disk on key, or a flash drive, or a memory stick, or whatever you want to call it. But functionally, it was all the same thing. They were similar to SD cards. USB flash drives also used flash memory. The flash drives became very popular as portable storage devices due to the convenience of their size and the ability to simply plug them into any computer's USB port for data transfer or data access. Intended to be the successor of the DVD, the Blu-ray optical disc was developed by Technology and Film Industry Consortium. The name was derived from the relatively shortwave blue laser, which is actually a blue-violet laser, and was capable of reading higher density data off these optical discs, as opposed to the red laser that was used for DVDs. The spelling of Blu-ray is not a mistake. You will see the BLU portion there. The character E was advertently dropped so that the term could be registered as a trademark, and therefore Blu-ray without the E. While older DVDs were only capable of holding multimedia with around a 480p resolution, the Blu-ray swooped in with more than double that capacity, and it was now able to fit high definition video on a single disc. The highest definition disc supported and stored around 25 gigs of high definition video at 1080p, which is around 36 CDs. Later versions were dual and triple layer and could support up to 50 to 100 gigs of data. Sony has since cranked up optical disc storage, and they are able to store 3.3 terabytes on an optical disc today. Blu-ray is currently struggling to survive because of the advent of video on demand, and many of us would rather just fire up Netflix than walk to a cupboard and take out a Blu-ray disc, put it in your Blu-ray player and push play. So this is also a disappearing technology. Solid-state drives, or in short, an SSD. An SSD performs the same basic function as a hard drive, but the data is instead stored on interconnected flash memory chips that retain the data even when there's no power flowing through them. These flash chips are of a different type than the kind used in USB thumb drives, and are typically faster and more reliable. The best thing about solid-state drives is that they are much faster and have higher read and write speeds than traditional hard disk drives, and this is especially true for random access patterns. They also have no moving parts, which means they don't make a noise and they don't break as easily. However, SSDs are typically more expensive than the equivalent hard drive for comparable capacity. Because SSDs and hard drives have different strengths in terms of efficiency, they actually complement each other and can coexist in a typical PC. SSDs deliver ultra-fast random data access, low power consumption. They have a small size and a high physical resilience due to not having any moving parts, but they cost more. So hard drives provide sufficiently fast sequential data access with high capacity endurance and reliability at a much lower price. So what one typically sees nowadays is that a PC would have a solid-state drive that the operating system resides on and that frequently accessed data, smaller frequently accessed data resides on. But archive data or keeping things such as photographs or videos, which are typically the larger files, but they are not accessed that often, those could just comfortably reside on a HDD or typically traditional hard drive. While these SSDs can be installed into the place of a traditional 2.5 or 3.5 inch hard drive bay, they can also be installed into a PCI slot, PCI or PCI Express expansion slot on the motherboard, or they can even be mounted directly onto the motherboard, a configuration that is now common in newer high-end laptops and all-in-ones such as tablets. These board-mounted SSDs use a form factor known as M2. There's an example of what an M2 SSD looks like compared to a standard SSD that one would typically see. The one on the right is about 3.5 inches in diameter. The one on the left is very much smaller. Here's an example of an M2 form factor SSD, which is installed on a motherboard. And you can note the relative size compared to the tip of the screwdriver that is being used to secure it onto the motherboard. So these are very, very small. The examples you see here are around 1 terabyte. And that is typically why nowadays in things such as tablets, the storage that is embedded within that tablet can be of a great magnitude, but a very small form factor. Previously, we spoke about cloud storage in one of the other talks that we had. So cloud storage also comes to play when we talk about data storage. All of these technologies that we discussed previously were technologies that were installed in computer mainframes or large corporate computers or even personal computers at home. And in both of those environments nowadays, cloud storage is being utilized and provides many benefits. Cloud storage does not remove the requirement for local storage within or attached to your computing device. But what it does result in is that you can cope with a much smaller local disk capacity configuration. And the bulk of the data could actually reside offsite in the cloud to be accessed where and when required. So now your storage capacity depends only on the plan that you can pay for. The options are actually endless. The first all web-based data storage system was named Personal Link Services. It was launched by AT&T in 1994. And since then, a name that we have all come to know is Amazon. Amazon Web Services launched their AWS S3 cloud storage in 2006. In part starting the trend towards massive cloud data storage. And nowadays, many companies such as Oracle, Microsoft, and many of the others offer cloud storage options. With cloud storage, remote databases are used to store information, and this is then made available to a computer system via internet access. One consideration is latency, or the time that it takes for the data to travel across the communication network. So typically, if one needs to access something and it resides on cloud storage, let's say in the US or in Europe, when that instruction gets access to read that piece of data, once the data has been identified and it starts being transmitted to your computer, it would take around 150 milliseconds to traverse the continents and the undersea cables to get to your PC. For computer programming purposes and processing purposes, that is actually a very, very long time. So many other ways have been devised where data living in the cloud could either be processed directly in the cloud, or one would have a synchronized offline storage on your computer. And some of these software packages and storage packages that are available, such as Microsoft OneDrive, will have a data synchronization facility where files that are accessed are brought to down to your local PC, and the processing then happens on a local version of that file, which once it is changed will actually be synchronized again with a version that lives in the cloud. You are also able to synchronize files that live in these cloud storage areas across multiple devices. So updating a file on your PC will allow you later on when you're at Woolies or at Pick n Pay and you suddenly realize that you need to access some of the data that you manipulated while you were at home. You can take your phone, open up OneDrive on your phone and browse to the relevant folder and actually read and see the same file. So there's a lot of convenience that goes with that. And also there's a lot of data protection. You know, if your hard drive on your PC backs up or has a technical error, then you still have your data living in the cloud and you can still get to it from either your tablet or your cell phone or just any other computer. So those are the nice things that it provides. Cloud storage, you'll see there on that diagram there, we start off with kilobytes, megabytes, terabytes, petabytes, and it goes all the way up to yottabytes. And if you're interested in what all of those means and how big they are, there are lots of information on the internet that would quantify that or try and describe that to you. But after cloud storage, the question is, what is next? Work is underway to store data in holograms. There's a lot of work being done in that area. But let me quickly show you about what Microsoft is currently doing about one of the what's next storage technologies. I'm going to show you another short little video, and I hope it goes off well in terms of everybody's available connectivity. So let me move on to that.
What if I told you that Superman was in this piece of glass? That is a breakthrough proof of concept from Microsoft's Project Silica, which aims to show that glass is the future of long-term data storage.
In this media, basically it doesn't decay. So once you've written the data in there, it's going to be there for 50, 100,000, 10,000 years.
To understand how it all works, we visited the Microsoft Research Lab in Cambridge, England, to get a demo of the whole process with our very own piece of glass.
We store the data by, first of all, when we're writing it, focusing a femtosecond laser inside the glass and firing incredibly short pulses of energy into the glass. And at the point where it's focused, a sort of structural change, let's call it structural change, happens to the glass, which forms what we call a nanograting. When we form that structure inside the glass, we're able to control both the depth and the angle. And that allows us to record multiple bits, both in the depth and in the orientation.
To prove Project Silica's usefulness outside the lab, Microsoft found a partner with a lot of important data to protect.
We do have the largest film and television library in the world. It's a responsibility we take incredibly seriously to make sure that this content is available for generations to come.
You know, they're one of these organizations that really worries about storing data for not just 10 years or 50 years, but they think in terms of hundreds of years.
Here at Warner Brothers Studios in Burbank, California, we got a glimpse of what high-stakes long-term data storage can look like. Inside a temperature-controlled vault so top secret, they wouldn't let me show you the outside of the building.
In total, we have about 750,000 film elements in these vaults. We've opened up one of the bays here so we can show you kind of how the film reels sit on the shelves.
One of the things about getting the technology real is to partner with companies and organizations like Warner Brothers to understand what they need from a technology like this in order for us to allow us to drive it in that direction.
Film is a very stable format, but for a lot of our new shows and movies, they're shot digitally. They're not shot on film. So we need to try to find an alternative to hard drives or LTO data tape.
What is incredibly satisfying about this is that this has resulted in something real.
The first Warner Brothers property to get the Project Silica treatment was the 1978 original Superman movie, condensing 22 reels of film into one piece of glass that could fit in your pocket. The Superman movie was chosen to pioneer this technology in part because of the Superman radio show, which was archived using glass records back in the 1940s.
When we did the Superman work with Warner Brothers, we wrote about 75.6 gigs of media files. We wrote another, I think probably 20 or 30 gigs that was error redundancy, so that should anything go wrong, we were able to reconstruct the movie.
What we're actually looking for is something that even has some physical attributes that are better than film, something that you could get wet, something that you don't have to store at a very low temperature like we do here for the film reels, something that would survive an electromagnetic pulse, a solar flare or something like that.
To show off some of the advantages of Project Silica, Microsoft put our little piece of glass through a gauntlet of torture tests.
If your media can cope with water, you can use different ways of extinguishing fires that are in a data center. If it can cope with heat, you perhaps don't need to cool the data center as much. Electric magnetic pulses, that's microwaves. The scrubbing and abrasion we just showed, because effectively you're writing inside the glass. If you think of something like a CD, you're effectively writing on the surface. So when you damage the surface or you do anything, you're actually impacting the data that you're storing. On this, we're storing it inside the glass, and therefore you're sort of not worried about the surface as much. If you crack the glass, the data that's still stored inside the glass still exists. If you really want to destroy it, you need to sort of either melt it or grind it up.
After the torture tests were finished, Microsoft was still able to read the data off our piece of glass.
We basically read the data back out by imaging the modifications that have happened inside the glass. In this building in Cambridge, we have the folks who worked on a lot of the original Kinect and a lot of the image processing for HoloLens. And so we were able to talk to them about how to actually do the image processing on our piece of glass.
This is probably the most promising real option we've seen to the gold standard of film, which we'd love for this to live side by side.
We started to develop this technology in the context of the cloud and thinking very much about how to make cloud storage faster, better, cheaper, more scalable. Working with Warner Brothers sort of helped us understand how the technology can help other companies and other people solve the problems that they've got, which were not the ones we were initially considering.
Microsoft is still working on increasing the read and write speed of its Project Silica glass, so it'll likely be a while before this sort of thing catches on at a large scale. It's also investigating other potential methods of storing data long-term, including DNA. Did you enjoy this video? Got any ideas for emerging tech you'd like to see featured on future WTF episodes? Let us know down below. Big thanks to my colleague Jide Akin-Renate in the UK for filming the Microsoft Cambridge half of this piece, and thanks to you all for watching. See you next time with the fam.
Good. So that brings us to the end. And we take the next question, Johan.
Derick, I've got one question, and
Yes.
I mean, in practical terms, for all of us today who are using a computer or a laptop, from what you've presented now, it appears to me an SSD is probably, before we get to the glass now, but the SSDs are the more practical thing to go for. Now, just in terms of durability, how long will an SSD last? I believe there is a limit to its life expectancy. And also price-wise, how does it compare to a hard drive or a portable USB drive?
Yes, the SSDs do have a limited lifespan due to the nature of the media in which the data is stored. But that is also, it's expanding and extending due to changing technology. If you look at the original SSDs compared to where we are today, and although it is finite, the number of times that you can write back to that SSD in number is so high that it typically would outlast an older spinning type HDD that you would have in your PC in the old days. That magnetic media would also deteriorate and eventually would start giving you problems. So I don't think from a practical perspective, it is really a huge consideration for normal use within personal computer use environment. Corporates that do write very high volumes of data, they do have, could have the situation where some of these drives reach end of life, but that would typically be catered for under a normal maintenance program, and the software and firmware that actually manages that will advise and highlight when these drives are reaching end of life, and one could then proactively swap those out and replace them. But for normal use in a house PC, I don't think it is really a consideration that you need to worry about. One would typically also, as I mentioned earlier, in my PCs that I have here, I have SSD for the frequently accessed and time-sensitive data, and then the rest of the stuff that is bulk, I keep that on my old HDD, which is not used a lot. And if you want to get something off there, such as a video, which are the larger files, those are still fine, to supply that data stream to you at a sufficient rate for you to be able to watch that without having stuttering or buffering or anything such as that.
And price-wise, comparing...
Price-wise, the prices are also coming down. You can buy bigger and bigger SSDs for similar prices, than to 2 years or 3 years or 4 years ago. It depends on the size that you buy. It could be from a couple of R100 to a couple of R1,000. It really depends on the brand. If you go onto Takealot and you search for SSD, you'll see several brands there, and it could be in your house by tomorrow, and it wouldn't really break the bank.
Your bank, thanks. Good. I've got a question here from, I'll get to you, Jeff, just now, from Bernard. Could DNA be used for storage, since storage is at the molecule level in DNA?
Yes. I'm not a scientist, but I have seen some press releases around DNA being used and some research being done on that level. So there's definitely labs that are looking into that and working on that technology to actually store data in DNA. Jeff, you wanted to say?
Yeah, I just wanted to add to what Derick was saying about the SSD. When I was making a lot of video, I installed an SSD drive because it was so much faster to write. So, publishing a video, a reasonable length video, was much quicker using SSD than a traditional hard drive. But I think it's well worth paying the extra for a good one, because mine eventually failed. But I think that was just a hard drive, a hardware issue. It was I probably didn't buy the best available, but they were certainly quicker to write, depending on what you're going to use it for.
Yes, Jeff. I mean, the SSDs are well suited towards small random access type of IOs, where you want small bits of data and they need to be gathered from all over on that disk. Things such as video processing tend to be sequential in nature. And therefore, although it is faster, those will also wear an SSD out quicker because of the volume of data that is written, repeatedly. So you would find that people often use SSDs for smaller bits of processing, and then still use the HDDs for these huge sequentially processing requirements. What I do have here is I can show you this quickly. Maybe it's a topic. So on a typical notebook, if you look on the side of the notebook or the laptop, you would see something that looks like this. I'll hold this a little closer. It's very thin, and it's got a little button there that you press, and then that ejects, and you can actually put a CD or a DVD in there. This typically would reside inside the notebook on the side of the notebook. So what one could do, if you had a notebook and you had, say, 1 terabyte HDD in there, but you also wanted a SSD in order to make things faster, then you could take out this drive, which will allow you to read CDs or DVDs. If you do not have that requirement anymore, you could toss that aside, and then you could buy something such as this, which you will see looks very similar to what I just showed you here. It's the same form factor, but if you look on the other side here, you'll see this black bit here is actually a void that will take a SSD that can be installed into this area here. It has a connector there that the SSD will plug into that is compatible with the SSD. And on the other side, it's got a connector there that will still be compatible with that slot where your old DVD or CD-ROM drive was installed in. And so it will take up the same space that was taken up by the CD or the DVD-ROM. You can actually take that little cover off the other unit and put it on the end here, so it looks the same as when you had the CD or DVD in that machine. And you would have the benefit of putting your operating system on that new SSD and having a much faster, much quicker, much more usable machine. These caddies, you could buy them on Takealot or at any computer shop, and you need a little bit of technical knowledge in order to install these. And you might have to reset up your PC because you need to reinstall the operating system onto here. There are ways of actually migrating those as well. But this specific unit that I've got in my hand here, I think I paid 250 Rand for this. And then the cost of the SSD, which was at the time, was about 600 Rand. So for about 800 Rand, I upgraded a notebook, and that notebook would boot up if you switch it on in maybe 1/10 of the time that it would utilizing the standard drive that was in there. So a very well worth upgrade in terms of older notebooks or PCs. If you do not have an SSD in there, think about adding one in a typical PC, which has a tower. There's lots of space in there. As long as that SSD can connect to a cable, it doesn't actually even have to be mounted into one of those drive bays, because the old hard drives were susceptible to movement and being knocked around, the SSD on. So you can just strap it with a cable tie to the side of the chassis and connect it to the cable and carry on using it.
So Derick, yeah, thanks for that. It sounds
Good. And just one small other thing. This is a CD, DVD, Blu-ray. They're all the same size. And in those days when Johan used to run around as a computer operator, eventually these optical drives made their way to the corporate world of mainframes as well. And this item that I've got in my hand here is the equivalent of a magneto-optical drive that was used in mainframe technology. You'll see in the center here, it actually has metal. And when you look at this, you might not be able to see it, but you can actually see the tracks running across and the sectors running across this device with a naked eye. But it's much bigger than what we are used to using in our PCs at home.
Thank
That's
you,
it from
Derick.
my side, John.
Yeah, thank you very much. It's fascinating, and one can see the effort that Derick put into this presentation. I found it very interesting, so thank you very much.